What does it mean to want someone back when you have already let them go? What does it cost a man who has never begged for anything in his life to walk into a church and do exactly that? And what happens to a woman who spent 2 years learning how to stop loving someone, only to hear his voice on the one day she has chosen to move forward? The answer to all three questions walked through those church doors wearing black. If you have ever loved someone you had to let go, or let go of someone who still loved you, do not leave this page. Subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, stay with us, and don't forget to mention the country you are watching from. This story will make you feel everything you have been trying not to feel. The ceremony had been perfect up until that moment. Everything inside the chapel of St. Augustine spoke of careful planning and quiet joy. White peonies ran the length of every pew. Ivory candles threw a warm, trembling light across the faces of 100 guests who sat with their hands folded and their hearts full. A string quartet played something soft enough to feel like a prayer. The pastor stood at the altar with the kind of peaceful expression that suggested he had done this many times and never once grown tired of it. Linda Osei stood beside her groom. She was breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with the dress, though the dress was extraordinary. Ivory silk that pulled gently at her feet, a neckline that framed her collarbones like a work of art, and natural hair pinned into a crown that her mother had spent 3 hours perfecting that morning while both of them pretended not to cry. But the thing that made guests lean toward each other and whisper was not the dress. It was the way Linda carried herself. Upright, luminous, and utterly present in the moment. She had worked hard for this piece. Every person in that room who knew her history understood what today represented. Her groom, David, stood beside her in a charcoal suit, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He was a steady man. The kind of man who checked your tires before long drives and remembered how you took your tea. He had loved Linda with patience and without condition for 14 months. And today he intended to say so in front of everyone she trusted. The pastor cleared his throat gently. If anyone here knows of any reason. The doors opened. Not with drama. Not with force. They swung inward on their hinges with a kind of quiet inevitability, the way doors open in dreams. Slowly enough that every person in the room had time to turn, time to register what they were seeing. Time to feel the temperature in the room shift by several degrees. He stood in the doorway. Young-ho Lim was 34 years old and had not been inside a church since the funeral of a man whose death he had indirectly arranged. He wore black from collar to shoe. No tie. The top button of his shirt open. His dark hair was shorter than it used to be. His jaw carrying a tension that suggested he had rehearsed this moment 100 times and abandoned the script the second he crossed the threshold. He was not a large man in the way that demanded physical space, but something about him made the room feel smaller. People who did not know him sensed it instinctively. People who did know him, and there were 2 in that room who did, felt something closer to ice moving through them. His eyes found Linda immediately. They did not search the room. They did not hesitate. They went directly to her, the way eyes go to the thing they have been looking for all along, and for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, he simply looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite sorrow and not quite relief. It was the expression of a man seeing, with absolute clarity, the precise magnitude of what he had surrendered. Then he spoke. I really want you back. His voice was low. It barely carried past the first 3 rows. And yet every single person in that chapel heard it because the silence was that complete. A woman in the 4th pew pressed her hand over her mouth. A man near the back shifted in his seat and said nothing. The string quartet had stopped playing. None of them could have said exactly when. Even the candle flame seemed to hold still. Linda's fingers moved. She was holding a small bouquet of white roses, and her fingers shifted against the stems, not tightening exactly but adjusting, the way fingers move when the body is working very hard to appear composed. Her chin stayed level. Her shoulders did not drop. But something changed in her eyes, a flicker brief and involuntary, like light passing across still water. David turned his head slowly and looked at the man in the doorway. His expression was not anger. It was the quiet, calculated composure of someone absorbing information and deciding, with great deliberateness, not to react to it yet. The pastor looked at Linda, then at Jung-ho, then back at Linda. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And Linda stood at the altar of a church on her wedding day, bouquet in hand, veil catching the candlelight, and looked at the man she had spent 2 years trying to forget, the man who had once whispered futures into her hair like promises he meant to keep, and she felt the ground beneath her do something it had no right to do. It remembered him too. If this story already has you gripped, you are going to want to stay till the very end. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment telling us. Would you have stayed or walked out? They had met on a Tuesday in October, which felt like the wrong kind of day for anything life-changing to happen. Linda had been 28, freshly appointed as a senior analyst at a private logistics firm in Seoul, one of only 3 foreign employees at the company, and by some margin the most unapologetically herself. She wore her natural hair to the office before it was fashionable to do so in those circles. She laughed loudly at things she found genuinely funny, which her colleagues found disarming because it was so completely without performance. She had moved to Seoul on a 2-year contract, and intended to learn exactly as much as the city was willing to teach her before returning to Accra with her savings, her experiences, and no complications. Jung-ho Lim was not supposed to be a complication. He had come to the firm's quarterly investor briefing not as a client but as a shadow, attending alongside a man named Chairman Kwon, whose legitimate business interests were numerous and whose other interests were the kind that did not appear in any document. Jung-ho sat 3 chairs to the chairman's left and did not speak once during the 2-hour meeting. He simply listened, watched, and occasionally made small marks in a notebook that no one else could read. Linda had been presenting the 3rd quarter analysis. She was mid-sentence when she noticed him noticing her. Not in the way men sometimes looked at women as interruption, but in the way a person looks at something that has genuinely surprised them. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second longer than professionalism required, and then continued her presentation without missing a beat. Afterward, in the narrow hallway outside the conference room, he had been standing beside the water dispenser. He was not waiting for her. She was certain of that later, turning the memory over like a stone. He had simply been there. "Your analysis of the 3rd quarter variance," he said as she reached past him to fill her glass, "was the most honest thing anyone has said in a boardroom in front of Kwon in 4 years." She looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It is a fact," he said. "Compliments are less useful." She laughed, the real laugh, the loud one, and he looked startled by it, not offended but genuinely caught off guard, as if the sound had reached something in him before he had time to redirect it. "Jung-ho Lim," he said. "Linda Osei," she replied. They shook hands the way professionals do, brief and correct, and she walked away thinking nothing of it. She had met serious men before. Seoul was full of them. He called the firm 2 days later, asking to arrange a separate consultation with their analytics team. Her name was mentioned as the lead contact. The meeting was scheduled, then rescheduled. Then it happened on a Wednesday afternoon with coffee going cold on both sides of the table, because neither of them had remembered to drink it. What followed was not a courtship in any conventional sense. There were no grand gestures at first, no flowers sent to the office, no declarations made in restaurants. It was slower than that and more serious. He asked her questions that no one had ever thought to ask, about how she saw numbers, about what she believed a pattern was trying to say before the data confirmed it, about the tension between intuition and proof. She answered honestly, as she always did. And somewhere in the honesty something between them shifted from professional to something else entirely. "You are not afraid of me," he said one evening. They were walking near the Han River, which had become their accidental habit after late meetings. The October air was cold and she had stolen his jacket without asking, which he had allowed without comment. "Should I be?" she asked. A pause. The river ran silver beside them. "Most people are." She looked at him sideways. "Most people probably have reasons." He said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "Yes." It was the first time he told her a truth about himself that cost him something, and she received it without flinching, which was when he began, without fully understanding why, to trust her. She learned who he was in pieces. Not all at once, not in a confession delivered over dinner, but slowly, the way you learn the shape of something by touching it in the dark. The Lim family was not simply wealthy. They operated in the spaces between legal and sovereign. An empire built across 3 generations that the Korean government officially knew nothing about and quietly relied upon for certain things to function smoothly. Jung-ho was not the head of the family. That was his father, a man who communicated mostly in silences. Jung-ho was the family's mechanism of enforcement, diplomacy, and controlled chaos, which in practice meant that people respected him the way people respect a fault line, quietly and from a safe distance. When Linda understood all of this, she sat with it for 3 days. She did not call him. She made herself tea and read and walked and thought carefully about what she valued and what she was willing to hold. On the 4th day she called him. "I am not going to pretend I understand your world," she said when he answered. "I would not ask you to," he said. "But I am not going anywhere," she told him. "Not yet. Not because of that." The silence on his end lasted long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated. Then he said very quietly, "Okay." That was the beginning. The months that followed were the best of Jung-ho's life, which he would not have known how to say aloud but felt with a certainty that frightened him in the way all certain things frightened men like him, because certainty was a liability in his world, and he had spent years learning not to want anything he could not afford to lose. Linda brought warmth into a life that had been architecturally cold. Not by forcing it but simply by being herself, which turned out to be enough. She cooked in his kitchen in the early mornings and played music he had never heard and laughed at him with genuine affection when he did not understand her references, and slowly he began to emerge from the controlled distances he maintained with other people and exist, tentatively, in the actual present. She taught him patience not by lecturing him about it but by modeling it, the way she sat with problems until they resolved, the way she listened to him fully before speaking, the way she never reacted before she had considered. He watched her and quietly reformed certain things in himself. He protected her without her knowing. There were people in his orbit who had assessed her as a vulnerability. He had made clear, in the specific language his world understood, that this assessment was a terminal error in judgment. She moved through Seoul unaware of the very precise machinery operating around her to keep her untouched. One evening they sat on the floor of his apartment, the city glittering below the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she laid her head against his shoulder. "Tell me what you actually want," she said. "Not what you manage. What you want." He was quiet for a long time. "This," he said finally. "Exactly this." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "Then let's build it properly." He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means I want a future, Jung-ho. A real one. Not something we have to hide." He did not answer immediately, but he reached for her hand and held it, and in the language of a man who expressed almost nothing, that meant more than he could have found words for. He proposed 4 months later. Not with ceremony. They were in the kitchen at 7 in the morning and she was eating toast and reading something on her phone, and he placed a ring on the counter beside her cup of tea, a simple band with a single stone, chosen because she had once said she found ostentation embarrassing and said, "I would like to do this properly." She looked at the ring, then at him. Then she cried, which was the last thing she had expected to do, and he held her while she did. She said yes. They told no one immediately. There was no announcement made, no celebration organized. But in the weeks that followed, something in both of them settled. the particular quiet that comes to a person who has decided where they are going to stand. It lasted exactly 63 days. The thing about men like Young-ho's father was that they did not oppose things loudly. They opposed them methodically, the way you dismantle a structure, removing the foundation quietly until what stands above it can no longer support its own weight. Park Sung-jin, Young-ho's father, had said nothing when Young-ho told him about Linda. Not a word of objection. He had listened, nodded once, and returned to his tea. Young-ho had mistaken this for acceptance. He would spend a long time afterward understanding exactly how expensive that mistake had been. The first thing that happened was small. A man Linda trusted at the firm, a colleague who had befriended her in the early months, began feeding carefully selected information about her to a journalist. Nothing scandalous, nothing false, but enough to make her visible in a way that professional women in her position could not afford to be. She noticed the story before it ran and pulled it apart with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything. But the message beneath the message was clear to Young-ho. She is exposed. And we are the ones exposing her. The second thing was less subtle. A woman appeared. A woman from Young-ho's past, produced like a document to be signed, accompanied by the quiet understanding that certain alliances the family depended on required the appearance of certain kinds of continuity. The woman was appropriate in every dimension his father valued. She was Korean. She was from a family whose interests interlocked with theirs. She had never asked a single question Young-ho did not want to answer. "This is what you will do," his father said. Not as a command, as a statement of fact. Young-ho sat across from his father in the study that smelled of cedar and old money and said nothing for a long time. "She has nothing to do with the family," he said at last. "She has everything to do with the family," his father replied. "The moment you put a ring on her hand, she became a question that our enemies will use. You have made her a target, Young-ho. Whether you intended to is irrelevant." The word landed where his father had aimed it. Target. Young-ho had spent his entire adult life managing threats. He knew exactly what happened to the people who stood in the wrong place beside the wrong man. He had seen it. He had, in certain specific and carefully unarticulated ways, been responsible for it. And he knew, with the specific clarity of someone who understood his own world without illusion, that his father was not threatening Linda. He was describing a reality that Young-ho had been refusing to look at. He sat with it for 2 weeks. He did not tell Linda. He answered her calls, met her for dinner, held her hand, and all the while something was closing inside him. A door drawn slowly shut against the light it was letting in, because the light could not stay and he did not yet know how to explain why. On the night he ended it, they were sitting in the apartment where they had sat so many evenings. She could tell something was wrong before he spoke. She had always been able to read the architecture of his silences. "Say it," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I cannot protect you and keep you," he said. She did not move. "What does that mean?" "It means loving me was becoming a target," he said. "It means that people exist who will find you useful as a way of reaching me, and I cannot guarantee." He stopped. The sentence broke apart. "So you are ending this," she said. Not a question. Yes. The silence between them was unlike any silence they had shared before. Those silences had been companionable, full of warmth and ease. This one was the absence of everything they had built. "Look at me," she said. He did. Her eyes were steady. She was not going to cry in front of him. He knew that about her, he knew it completely. But the steadiness cost her, he could see that too. Every calm surface has something pressing against it from below. "You could choose differently," she said. "I know," he said. "But you are not going to." "No." She nodded once. Stood. Picked up her coat from the back of the chair. And then she said the words he would carry for the next 2 years like something lodged in his chest. "Then remember this moment, Young-ho. because you will not get another one like it." She walked out. He let her. And that was the second worst mistake of his life. If you are still watching, good. Because we are about to get to the part that changes everything. Like this video and drop a comment. Was he right to let her go? Or did he choose power over love? Back to the wedding. The chapel had not moved, but the air inside it felt entirely different from the air that had occupied it 60 seconds before Young-ho stepped through the doors. Something invisible had rearranged itself. Every person sitting in those pews was processing a completely different version of the moment they were witnessing, and none of them had all the information except for two people. And those two people were on opposite ends of a very short, very charged stretch of polished stone floor. Linda turned fully to face him. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She stood exactly where she was at the altar in her wedding dress, and she looked at him with an expression that guests would describe afterward in conflicting ways. Some said devastated, some said furious, some said utterly unreachable. The truth was that it was all three at once, and the control required to contain all three simultaneously was visible in the set of her jaw and the absolute stillness of her hands. "Young-ho," she said. Just his name. Flat and quiet and full. He walked forward slowly. Not quickly enough to alarm anyone. Not slowly enough to seem uncertain. He stopped about 4 meters from the altar, which was close enough for the conversation to remain private, and far enough to demonstrate that he understood this was not his space. David had turned fully to face him now. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his breathing measured, and he said nothing, which was the right call. Every instinct the man possessed was telling him that this was not his moment to act but to witness. "Why did you come?" Linda asked. "You know why," Young-ho said. "I want to hear you say it properly." He held her gaze. "Because I failed to say goodbye properly. And because I could not let today pass without you knowing." He paused. His jaw moved. "Without you knowing that I am sorry. Not in the way people say sorry when they have run out of better options. Sorry in the way that means I have understood, finally and completely, what I threw away." A woman in the second row pressed both hands over her heart. Linda did not move. "You ended it, Young-ho." "Yes." "You looked me in the eye and chose to end it." "Yes." "And now you are standing in my church," she said. And there was something in her voice that was not anger exactly but something older and more complicated. Grief that had been processed and packaged and placed in a high shelf, now vibrating from the disturbance below it. "On my wedding day. In front of everyone I love." "I know," he said. "Do you think that was fair?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was simply, "No. It was selfish. I came because I am selfish. I came because I have been selfish about you from the beginning." And something in that honesty, its completeness, its refusal to dress itself up, made three separate guests exhale. David spoke for the first time. His voice was low and measured. "What is it that you actually want from her? Right now. Say it clearly." Young-ho looked at him, really looked at him, assessed him the way he assessed everything, and whatever he found there made him nod just barely in something that looked almost like respect. "I want her to know," Young-ho said, "that leaving her was not about power. It was about fear. And I have spent 2 years lying to myself about the difference. That's all. I am not here to interrupt anything." He paused. "I am here because I owed her the truth, and I ran out of time to deliver it quietly." Linda closed her eyes for a moment. 1 breath. 2. When she opened them, they were bright. "Sit down, Young-ho," she said. He looked at her. "I am not finished yet," she said. And it was not an invitation. It was a boundary drawn with precision, and behind it was something enormous and unresolved and entirely hers to manage. He nodded and moved toward the back of the chapel. A guest shifted. Another one cleared their throat. He took a position standing near the last pew, not sitting, one hand resting on the carved wood, and he watched. The pastor looked at Linda. "Are you all right?" he asked very quietly. She straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said. "I am." But she was not looking at the pastor when she said it. It was David who reached for her hand. Gently, without a word, he simply extended his toward her, and she looked at it for a moment before taking it, and the warmth of his palm against hers did something she had not expected. It did not erase what had just happened, but it grounded her in where she was and who was standing beside her and why she had chosen this. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. At the back of the chapel, Young-ho saw this. His hand tightened on the pew. The pastor cleared his throat with immense diplomacy and looked at the congregation. "I believe," he began. "Wait." Young-ho's voice quiet, cutting across the chapel like a stone across still water. Every head turned. He was walking forward again. Something in the room contracted. The matron of honor, Linda's best friend Kayamika, a formidable woman in gold who had been watching this entire scene with the expression of someone calculating exactly how much physical force she was prepared to deploy if required, shifted in her seat. David's hand around Linda's did not release. But Young-ho stopped. He stopped several feet from where he had stood before, and then he did something that no one in that room, not Linda, not anyone who had ever known him, not anyone who had ever heard his name spoken in the specific tone people used when they meant someone to be taken seriously, would have predicted. He knelt. Not on one knee the way a proposal is made. On both. A full, deliberate, unambiguous act of submission from a man for whom submission was not a vocabulary he possessed. His hands rested on his thighs. His back was straight, and he looked up at Linda from the floor of her wedding chapel with an expression stripped of everything he normally carried. The control, the precision, the carefully managed distance. And what was left beneath all of it was simply a man. A sound moved through the congregation. Not words. Just sound. Linda's lips parted. "I am not asking you to choose me," Young-ho said, and his voice did not shake, but it was low, and it was reaching, and it was real in a way that very little in his life had ever been allowed to be. "I am not here to take anything from you. I am not here to undo what you have built. You built it because you deserved better than I gave you, and you were right." And a brief pause, a glance toward David. "He may be exactly what I was not able to be." Silence. "But I am asking you to remember why we loved," he said. "Not so that you will choose differently. Just so that you know I remember. So that you know it was real. So that you know that what happened between us was not nothing. That I was not absent. That somewhere inside the man I was required to be, I loved you, Linda. Completely. Without qualification. And losing you was the most honest thing I have ever felt." Two guests were crying openly. The woman with her hands over her heart had not moved. Kayamika, in the gold dress, was completely still, and the expression on her face had shifted from combat readiness to something that looked almost like recognition. David stood very quietly beside Linda. And Linda stood at the altar of her wedding, with her roses in her hand and her crown of hair and her ivory dress, and she looked at this man kneeling on the floor of a church he had no right to enter, and she felt what she had worked for 2 years to dismantle. The actual love, the original one, the one that had started over a cold cup of coffee and built itself out of honest answers and river walks and Tuesday mornings in his kitchen, rise up through the careful architecture of her recovery. Like water through stone. She felt it. And she made her choice. This is the moment everything hangs on. Do not go anywhere. If this story has moved you, subscribe and leave a comment below. What should she do? She walked to him. The congregation exhaled as one. Kayamika half rose from her seat. David went very still. Linda stopped directly in front of Young-ho, where he knelt on the floor, and she looked down at him for a long moment without speaking. Her face was composed. Her eyes were full. She reached out her hand. He looked at it. Then she did something no one expected. She did not help him rise. She placed her palm against his face. The way you touch something you are saying goodbye to, And she held it there and his eyes closed and the entire room disappeared. "You were the great love of my life," she said quietly. Quietly enough that the first row could only just hear. "I need you to know that. What we had was real. You were real. And I loved you in a way I did not know I was capable of before you." His jaw moved beneath her hand. "But you left," she said. "Young-ho. You looked at me and you chose. And I went home and I fell apart and I put myself back together. And it took everything I had, every single piece of me to build back what you broke. And I did it. I did it, and somewhere in the doing of it I found this." She gestured slightly toward the chapel, the flowers, the man standing at the altar behind her. "I found someone who stays. Someone who does not weigh me against his fear and find me expendable." Young-ho did not speak. "You came too late," she said. The words were not cruel. They carried no edge of revenge, no performance of finality designed to wound. They were simply true, and she delivered them with the same directness she had brought to everything. To her work, to her grief, to the slow and difficult business of choosing a different life. "You came too late," she said again. Softer. Almost tender. She withdrew her hand from his face. She turned. She walked back to David, who had not moved, who stood with his hands loose and his face open and his presence steady as ground. And she took his hand and she looked at the pastor and she said, in a voice that was completely clear, "We can continue." The pastor opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He was a man of great faith and long experience, and he had married people through thunderstorms, power failures, and 2 memorable interruptions, but he had never presided over anything quite like this. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at his notes and then back up at the couple. "Dearly beloved," he said. At the back of the chapel, Young-ho rose from the floor. He rose slowly, without assistance, with the particular dignity of a man who has paid for something in full and knows it. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Linda one last time, her back, her crown of hair, the ivory train of her dress fanned across the steps of the altar, and he looked at her the way you look at a city you are leaving. Completely. With the knowledge that you will not be back. He walked to the doors. He passed the woman with her hands over her heart. He passed the man who had shifted in his seat. He passed Kayamaka, who watched him go with an expression he could not read and perhaps did not deserve to. He walked the full length of the chapel, his footsteps quiet on the stone floor, and no one spoke and no one moved, because there was nothing to do but let him go. He reached the doors. He pushed them open. The afternoon light came in, gold and wide and indifferent, and for a moment he stood in the frame of it, his back to the ceremony, his face to the outside world, and somewhere behind him the sound of a ceremony continuing drifted forward. He walked out. The doors swung shut behind him. Inside, the ceremony continued. David's voice, low and full, began to recite his vows. Linda's fingers, still, no longer trembling, held the white roses and the hand of the man who had chosen to stay. Guests wiped their eyes with the backs of their hands and tried to compose themselves for what was, in every structural and legal sense, a wedding that was going forward. Outside the church, Young-ho stood on the stone steps. The city moved around him. Traffic. Pigeons. A child laughing somewhere down the block. He stood in all of it and breathed, and after a long moment he took his phone from his pocket and looked at it. Not to call anyone, not to send a message, but simply to do something with his hands while the world rearranged itself around the absence of what he had just walked away from a second time. The difference was that this time she had not asked him to stay. And that difference, the distance between a door you choose to close and a door that closes on you, was a weight he would carry without complaint, because he had earned it, and because the woman inside that chapel deserved, above all things, the freedom to be chosen by someone who would not calculate the cost. He walked down the steps. He did not look back. And somewhere behind those doors, in the warm candlelight of St. Augustine's chapel, Surrounded by peonies and the quiet weeping of moved guests and the steady voice of a pastor who had recovered his composure beautifully, Linda Osei became Linda Mensa and held the hand of the man who had stayed, and wept, finally, for all of it. The love, the loss, the long road back to herself, and the extraordinary grace of being able, after everything, to begin again. The camera, if there had been a camera, would have cut to black right there. It would have been exactly right. And that is where we leave them. Love is not simply about the moment you find someone. It is about who you are willing to become, and who you choose to be when it costs you. Jung-ho loved her. And love was not enough. Not because love is ever truly insufficient, but because a love you refuse to protect is a love you have already begun to abandon. She touched his face and told him the truth. That is more than most people get. If this story moved you, please subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us, did she make the right choice? And like this video if you stayed until the very end. You earned it.